The Skeleton Tree, Chapter 9, Maggots.
A sound like a gunshot startles me out of my memories. It's loud and flat, and I look up with the thought that someone has fired a signal. But the sea is empty. I realize that all I heard was the slap of a seal's tail or the burst of a whale's breath. In the north, the fog bank looks bigger. The sun glares off the top of it, but underneath it's thick with shadows. I wonder if the ship that will save us is traveling alongside of it, ready to burst at any moment into the sunshine. Today is the day we'll be saved. I believe that. Maybe when I reach the end of the novel, when Catel finds the man who killed his father, that's when they'll arrive. I convince myself it's true. Until I remember that there is no ending. Not anymore. I take the book from the bucket and bend it open. A page falls out, fluttering away like an autumn leaf. It will leave another small hole in the story, something for Frank to argue about. I find my place near the beginning. The Skraelings have murdered Valgard on his farm, and now the man with yellow eyes is running across the fields, chasing Valgard's wife and child. Over the meadow she ran, over the stony slope. On her back bounced Catel, laughing at the game. But this was no game. The man with yellow eyes chased them to the river, where the woman dropped to her knees. Down to her knees she fell, with her arms shielding little Catel. "Please," she begged, "please spare the boy, oh please." But her pleas fell on deaf ears. With one blow, the Skraeling split her skull. Catel lay beside her, giggling at the sight of his toes sticking up in the air. He tried to touch them and giggled again. The man with yellow eyes washed his sword in the river and left them lying together in the grass. At dusk the ravens came. I don't understand why Frank loves this book so much. To me, the best parts are the notes that the cabin guy made. They're scrawled with red felt pen. True, ravens flocked to battlefields. All through the book are similar comments. In his lonely cabin, the man must have become obsessed with the story. He knew a lot about ravens. I keep thinking of Thursday. When Frank barged into the cabin, Thursday lifted his head. In the raven's eyes was a look of fear and betrayal, and he shrieked as he spread his wings. Frank swung the gaff. "Don't!" I shouted. There was an awful thud. Frank had missed Thursday and hit the swinging slab of fish instead. It exploded into chunks of flesh and bone. "Stop it!" I cried. But Frank was in a fury, and the raven in a panic. They blundered around the cabin through the dangling fish. Thursday smashed against the window, screaming in fright. He tried to squirm out through the hole, then fled across the cabin up towards the smoke hole. Frank stumbled over the wooden chair and hurled it out of his way. "Frank, stop!" I shouted. "Leave him alone!" Thursday was flapping so hard against the roof that I thought he would break his wings. Frank smashed another salmon, splattering the wall with its bits of bone. Thursday took his chance to fly out through the open door. "I'll kill him!" cried Frank. "I swear to God, I'll kill him!" We stood at the table, both breathing heavily as we looked at the destruction around us. A dozen salmon, a week's worth of food, lay smashed into ragged chunks all over the cabin. Nearly bare skeletons hung from the ceiling, still swinging and turning on their hangers. It was such an awful waste, and to make it even worse, Thursday had only eaten a tiny bit of fish, if anything at all. The table was covered with little bits of flesh, as though he had pecked the fish apart for the pleasure of destroying it. I felt sad and hopeless, and then I saw the maggots. They crawled in and out of the pieces of salmon. They writhed on the floor and squirmed on the tabletop. It wasn't the salmon the raven had been after. It was the maggots. I grabbed one of the hanging fish and twisted it like a rope. A clump of maggots tumbled out. I saw others twitching among the ribs and backbone. It was the same for the next fish, and the one after that. It was the same for nearly every salmon that we'd caught. The sight made me sick. I had eaten that fish. We had both eaten it just the night before. We threw away every salmon that we'd caught, hauling them down the trail. From the top of the skeleton tree, Thursday watched us drag the salmon to the rocks. Black and ragged looking, he stood in silence. "He doesn't understand why we're throwing out the fish just when it's getting ripe," I said, trying to make Frank smile. I held up a piece of maggoty fish and called Thursday down to get it. But the raven wouldn't move from the tree. He looks sad, I told Frank. You should tell him you're sorry.
I'm not telling him I'm sorry, said Frank. He was stealing the fish.
He was stealing the maggots.
Well, I'm still not saying I'm sorry,
said Frank with a flick of his hair.
He should say sorry to me.
Then he started laughing, and so did I, because it seemed so stupid. And Thursday up in the tree made one of his lovely raven sounds, as though it pleased him to see us happy. Piece by piece we threw away every fish we'd caught into the sea. Frank stared down at little stains of salmon oil that bubbled up to the surface. He brushed crumbs of salmon from his hands.
We have to start all over,
he said.
But we've got to have a fire. We have to have a fire.
How? I asked.
I don't know. He crossed his arms. Oh, I wish my dad was here.
He had never sounded so small. He was, for a moment, a little boy convinced that everything would be all right if only his dad could appear. I remembered thinking like that when I was little, believing my father was a Superman, stronger and smarter than anyone in the world. I couldn't remember when that changed. We tried everything we could think of to start a fire. We chipped stones against other stones and stones against metal, trying to make a spark. We gathered bits of glass from old bottles and shattered fishing floats and tried to focus sunlight into little piles of moss and twigs. But nothing worked. And that night we went to bed hungry for the first time in many days. Frank jammed bits of wood in the window frame, and when Thursday came to the cabin in the morning, he ordered me not to let him in. I didn't want to get in a big fight, so I just covered my ears as the raven tapped and muttered. It was hours before he gave up and went away. We had no breakfast. Dead flies and flakes of salmon lay all over the floor. I brushed the mess away as Frank settled down to try and make fire again. With a bunch of sticks and an awful sigh of resignation, he went to work. I saw this on Survivor Man, he said. It can't be that hard. I didn't want to sit there and watch him get angry, so I went walking along the beach to look for cigarette lighters. Wrapped up in my poncho blanket, I thought I looked like Zorro. Thursday appeared as soon as I reached the sand, but he stayed in the treetops, dashing from one to another in a funny little bursts of fancy flying. He flipped on his back or rolled right over as he zoomed from tree to tree. I searched through the driftwood, peering under every log. When I found a lighter, I snatched it up with a shout, but it was rusted and useless. Thursday came down to see what I was doing. He followed me along the logs, peering into the places I searched. Then he strutted along ahead of me, bouncing from log to log. It surprised me when he plucked a lighter from a tangle of wood. It amazed me when he did it again. He laid them out on the sand and called to me with a little cry. "You're a clever bird," I said, and he answered with funny chirping sound. When I climbed the trail back to the cabin, Thursday was again riding on my shoulder. I had 3 lighters in my pocket and a plan to light the gas inside of them, and I felt like a Stone Age hunter bringing fire to his cave. I could hardly wait to show Frank. But he wasn't there. Our bits of glass were scattered across the floor. So were 2 of Frank's sticks, snapped angrily in half and tossed away. A third was stuck like a knife into the foam mattress. I felt a bit sorry for Frank. I sat and watched Thursday playing with the glass. He arranged 6 pieces near the stones of the fire circle, and now he stood perfectly still beside them. When a beam of sunlight burst through the window and sparkled on the glass, he rushed forward and shuffled the pieces around. He moved them here, he moved them there. He turned them with his beak and talons. Then he stepped back and bobbed his black head, as though to see how they shone. The beam of light vanished, and the cabin darkened, and Thursday didn't move until another shaft of light set his pieces glowing. Again he moved them around in a great hurry. I watched him do this 4 times before I realized it was more than a game. He was using the glass for prisms, shining sunlight into dark spaces below the bed. At last, with a sharp cry, he darted under there and came back holding something in his beak. He set it down in front of me, the knob from the radio. I put it on the narrow windowsill and reached out to pet Thursday. He nuzzled against me. "Clever bird," he said. "Yes," I told him, "you're a very clever bird." He hopped up onto my lap. I stroked his little feathers on top of his head, feeling the hardness of his skull underneath. "Where's Frank?" I asked. Thursday peered at me as though he knew but just couldn't say. It was late in the afternoon when I walked to the stream in the forest, and on to the very high cliffs. I looked north towards the river, but saw no sign of Frank. Of course I imagined all sorts of things, that he had gone, at last, to climb his mountain, that he had fallen from the rocks into the sea, that the bear or a wolf had caught him. And then a thought even worse came into my mind, that someone had come to save him. Maybe a boat had gone by or a helicopter had landed and Frank was on his way home. I could imagine him sitting with his rescuers, not saying a thing about me, just watching with that smug look as the land faded in the distance. If anyone could do that, it was Frank. The sun began to set and there was still no sign of him. I picked a few handfuls of berries and sedge and went back to the cabin. It felt lonely and deserted. The empty bed seemed sad, with the shape of Frank pressed vaguely into the foam. On my shoulder, Thursday looked around. "Filthy birds," he muttered. Even then I didn't sit on the bed. I folded up in my own little place on the floor, and it was quite a long time before I suddenly noticed that the gaff was missing. "He went fishing," I shouted, slapping my hand against my forehead. That startled Thursday and I laughed, relieved. "I'm so stupid," I said. "I should have thought of looking for the gaff. If I had noticed sooner, I could have gone up to the river. But now it was too late, too dark. I could only sit and wait for Frank to come back." When the sun set, Thursday flew away. I tried hard to keep him inside, but he went out through the window, into the darkness. I peered after him until he vanished, wondering where it was that he went every night. As the sound of his wings faded, my worst nightmare came true. I was alone in the wilderness. I couldn't stop thinking of the hugeness of Alaska, of the mountains and snow, of the forest full of bears and wolves. I thought of the cabin guy, the skeletons. I wanted to cry, to scream for help, just as I had imagined on the airplane. I closed myself up in the cabin and took the cigarette lighters from my pocket. In the last bit of daylight, I tried desperately to make a fire. On the beach it had seemed easy. I had imagined every step, how I'd twist the metal tops, how I'd pry the little flints. The gas wasn't important. All we had was the can of fuel from the cabin guy's stove. All I needed was a spark, but the metal wouldn't bend as I wanted. The flints were ground away or frozen by rust, and I threw everything away in frustration. I heard one lighter ricochet off the wall, another rattle on the floor, and I shouted, "Stupid, useless lighters!" I heard my voice, shrill as the one on the mountain, and felt ashamed. I was acting just like Frank. Maybe we were not so different after all. Lonely and frightened, I hugged myself in the darkness. I rocked like a baby. And finally I broke the promise I had made on the mountain and cried for my father to help me. When the window began to brighten, I thought morning had arrived, but it was only the moon rising over the distant mountains, filling the cabin with a cold and silvery light. All the things blinded by the dark began to move outside. Something scurried past the door. Something chattered. Something screamed. Then something big came trampling along the trail, pushing through the bushes. And through the wall came the faint sound of someone whistling. An old, forgotten memory slowly woke inside my head. The whistled notes faltered and started again. I didn't know the words, and I couldn't name the song, but I remembered where I heard it. I was suddenly a tiny boy again, squatting on the kitchen floor. I saw my father all scrunched up under the kitchen sink trying to work on plumbing pipes that were, to him, as mysterious as ancient writing. He frowned and squinted, jiggled the pipes, and hummed that song. He had come to save me. With the memory so strong in my mind, my first thought was to rush out to meet him, my big towering father who would sweep me up in his arms. But he was dead. For a year he had been lying in his grave, and he couldn't possibly be out there in the forest. The little snatch of a song whistled again. A cold prickle tingled down my neck, and the thought of my dead father out there. I had wished him alive, back from the grave. I had seen his ghost before. On the night before his funeral, I had lain in bed remembering the good and the bad. He had appeared in my doorway and waved to me sadly. Just for a moment he had been there. But a year before that, on a drizzly Sunday in Vancouver, I had seen something even more puzzling. Dad was in Chicago on a business trip, 2,000 miles away. He had been gone for 3 days and wouldn't be home for 3 days more. I wasn't even thinking about him as I rode the SkyTrain with Mom. I looked down as the train squealed around the bend to the Dunsmuir Tunnel, and there he was at a traffic light, stepping out into the street. I saw him for less than a second, in a clack-clack-clack of the train wheels, striding over the white lines of the crosswalk, his legs and the shadows of his legs worked like scissors, everything shiny in the rain. "There's Dad!" I shouted. "Don't be silly," said Mom, turning in her seat. Then the tunnel closed around us. I wanted to get off at the next station, to go back and find him, but Mom said no. I wanted to get off at the next station, to go back and find him, but Mom said no. "Your father's in Chicago, you know that. It was just someone who looked like your dad." But I knew what I had seen, and I made her call him on the cell phone. "Oh, for heaven's sakes," she said. But she fished it out of her purse and called. I heard his voice telling her the exact same thing.
"I'm in Chicago, you know that."
But she looked so worried and pale that I thought she believed I had seen his doppelganger, or changeling, or something. The feeling that had come over me then returned as I crouched in the corner of the moonlit cabin. I heard the door rattle. Then it opened. A figure stood in the moonlight, and a creaky voice spoke to me. "Greetings, Earthlings." I gasped, but it was only Frank who stood there, only Frank who laughed at my fear. For once he was happy.
"I got a fish,"
he said, holding it out. It was a small one, and he had eaten more than half of it. He tossed me the rest, then put the gaff on the table.
"I got caught by the tide on the way back," he said. "I had to wait at the old wreck. But look what I found."
From his jacket pocket, he produced something dark and shiny. But it was his hand that I stared at, his right hand, as white and puffy as a marshmallow. "What's wrong with your hand?" I said. He only glanced at it.
"That's salmon slime," he said. "It's nothing."
"But you're swollen up," I said. He was shouting now.
"That's just the slime. It gets in your cuts. I told you, it's nothing."
He slammed into the table the thing he had brought from the breach. It was a purse. A little pink purse made of shiny plastic. It was a thing a child must have carried. "What's inside of it?" I asked.
"I don't know," he said. "It's rusted shut."
Frank was pouting. He was angry that I had been more interested in his swollen hand than in the purse that he'd found. It sat between us now, a little brass catch turned brown with rust. He could have opened that lock in a moment. I realized that he wanted to wait until he was with me to share the excitement of looking inside. Now he just sighed, sniffed, and whistled once more those few little notes. "What's that song?" I asked. He growled at me.
"I don't know. It came into my head and I can't get it out. My mom used to sing it."
In a moment he was asleep. His legs were still bent over the edge of the bed, and he was lying in the exact same position in the morning, when Thursday woke him with a raven call. The bird's head appeared in the window. His little eyes swiveled towards me, but he wouldn't come in.
"What's wrong with it now?"
asked Frank. "I think he's scared of you," I said.
"Good."
I had to get up and stand guard by the window while Thursday slipped into the cabin. He hopped up to my shoulder and down to the table where a child's pink purse lay unopened. Thursday nudged it with his beak. He was always attracted to things that sparkled.
"Give me that," said Frank. "I'll open it."
He struggled to sit up. His legs had gone stiff, and he lurched across the cabin like a robot. From his pocket he took out the knife, then pried at the latch. With a little crackling sound it broke loose and flicked away across the cabin. Frank emptied the purse onto the bed, just as he had shaken out the orange box on our first day in the cabin. On the table, Thursday leaned forward to watch, his black eyes shining. I stood beside Frank as he sorted quickly through the things. He sounded disappointed.
"Look at that," he said. "What a stupid bunch of junk."
But it wasn't stupid, and it wasn't junk. The whole life of a little girl lay scattered across the bed. There was a small stuffed cat and a yellow paperclip, a little toy horse with blue eyes, a silver tiara made of plastic, a blue sucker head turned into a sticky mess, and 4 tiny worry dolls made of thread and cloth were tangled together, their arms entwined as though they were hugging each other. There were other things, too. None was any use to us, but to one little girl from Japan, they must have been the most important things in the world. It seemed awful that they were disconnected now, and forever. from the memories that had made them valuable. Without those connections, maybe they were only junk. It made me remember when my father died, and I kept finding his things where he had left them. His cufflinks and tie clasps, crumpled wrapper from a candy bar. When I went into the garage a month later, I found a coffee mug balanced on the seat of my old bicycle, and it still had coffee in it. But Frank couldn't see past the junk.
I can't believe I wasted my time with that, he shouted.
He scattered the little girl's treasures across the mattress. He hurled the purse against the wall.
It's junk!
What did you expect? I asked.
Something good, I don't know. Maybe a magnifying glass or a lighter that actually works. Maybe a cell phone. Who knows?
A cell phone? So that was what Frank had really been hoping for? That was why he waited to open the purse, so I could be there as he pulled out the cell phone and dialed 911? Oh, hi, this is Frank. The thought made me feel sorry for him. A cell phone wouldn't be any good anyway, I said. It would be all wet and...
It still would have had a battery, moron,
said Frank. So what? He glared at me.
You think you're so smart. Figure it out.
I could only think of one thing. You mean the cabin guy's radio? It still sat on the shelf above the bed. Frank even glanced towards it.
Those batteries can last forever if they're charged.
He sounded angry, as though he thought I wouldn't believe him. But he was frustrated that his plan had not worked out.
I never knew girls carried so much stupid stuff, he said.
Then he grabbed the corner of the mattress and dumped everything onto the floor. Without a word, I dropped to my knees and picked it all up. Thursday, thinking it was just a game, rounded up the little horse and the worry dolls. I packed the things carefully into the purse again, knowing I was doing exactly what some little girl must have done in Japan on the morning of the tsunami. Of course Frank laughed at me.
Playing dollies?
He asked. He flicked his hair. It was a filthy clump that hung over his eyes now, matted with salt and tree sap.
Give me that,
he said, holding out his hand.
I'll throw it away.
No, I said.
Why not?
I didn't want to tell him what I had in mind. He wouldn't understand. He would say it was stupid. He stood with his hand reaching out, but I wouldn't give him the purse. That made him angry again. He grabbed my wrist. He grabbed the purse. He tried to twist it out of my hands, but I turned away and tightened my arms around it. Leave me alone, I said.
No, he shouted. Give me that.
Frank hauled me to my feet. As we reeled across the cabin, Thursday spread his wings. His beak opened wide and his eyes shone darkly. I wrestled with Frank for the purse. He kept pulling and pushing until he drove me up against the wall. My shoulder slammed into the wood. I grunted. With a shriek, the raven rose from the floor. His wings seemed to fill the whole cabin, and the sound they made was like wind in the forest. He swooped at Frank's head, beating it with his wings. Frank stumbled away, his arms flailing, but Thursday swooped again. Stop it! I shouted at both of them, worried at first for Thursday and then for Frank. My raven was trying to tear out his eyes. Frank covered his head with his arms. The raven clutched onto him, still screaming, wings flapping.
Get him off! Shouted Frank. Get him off!
He spun around the cabin as though he was on fire. He crashed into the table and toppled the rickety chair. I heard the tap-tap of the raven pecking at his hands. Frank kept shouting. He tried to push the bird away as he staggered across the room. Then he tripped over the firestones and dropped to his knees. I grabbed Thursday. I put my hands around his body, closing his wings. Through the tips of my fingers I could feel his heart beating like crazy. I tried to pull him away, but his talons were locked onto Frank's skin. He was so frantic that he turned his head and tried to peck me, but I held him more tightly, and the pressure of my hands seemed to calm him. He stopped struggling and let go of Frank. As soon as I loosened up my hold, he burst free. He hurled himself up against the window and burst out through the flaps. Frank staggered back against the bed. He fell onto the foam pad and crashed against the wall. His hands were cut across the knuckles, scratched all the way from fingers to wrists. The right hand was worse, the one swollen by little cuts and salmon slime. With a grimace, Frank jammed it under his arm.
Get rid of that bird, or I'll kill it,
he said. He was trying to help me, I said. You shouldn't have pushed me like that. In a moment, we were shouting at each other.
I told you, said Frank. He's too wild. He's dangerous.
He's just a raven, I said. I felt Frank might hit me, but he only sat on the bed, hunched up like a child.
Get out of here, he said. Leave me alone.
I thought he was crying. Frank, I said.
Leave me alone, he screamed.
I might have yelled right back, except I realized that Frank wasn't angry at me. He was angry at the child for not carrying a cell phone in her purse, at the flies and the maggots for spoiling the fish, at my Uncle Jack for taking us sailing. I remembered what he'd said about people going crazy, and I thought he was coming close to that himself. I quietly took the child's purse and went out to the forest. I knew just where to go, to that quiet old forest where the moss was thick and woolly, as soft as whipped cream. I scooped out a hole, but before I laid the purse in it, I took out the 4 worry dolls and held them in my fist. They were too small to have hands or faces, but somehow they looked wise and somber. My mother had given me 3 worry dolls after my father's funeral. "Whisper to them," she told me. "Tell them what scares you. Then put them away. They'll take on your fears and your worries so you won't have to think about them anymore." I had stayed awake all night, telling them everything, whispering my fears of my mother's dying next, of being left poor and homeless. And now in the forest of Alaska, it surprised me to see that my fears hadn't changed. I was afraid of being alone, of being hungry and cold. I held the worry dolls close to my lips and whispered these things. As though bringing an answer, Thursday arrived. I saw him falling, wings spread, through the bolts of sunlight to land on the moss nearby. He sang with a quivering call as I put the dolls in the purse and the purse in the ground. He was the witness to a funeral for a girl I'd never met. Grim and black, he sat there until I finished. Then he came with me to the cabin, swooping ahead around the bends in the trail. When I opened the door, he hopped right in. I was surprised to see Frank reading Catel, the Raven Hunter, and especially surprised that he seemed to be halfway through it already. I would never have imagined him with a book in his hands, and I told myself that he must have begun in the middle, or was just reading little pieces here and there. Lying flat on the bed, he glared at Thursday, who shouted a warning as he crossed the cabin and settled in the corner. They eyed each other across the small room like a pair of crazy old gold miners.
"I warned you," said Frank. "Keep that bird away from me."
"Don't worry," I said. From my place on the floor, I watched Frank turning the pages of the book. His right hand was cut and bleeding, with a little trickle of red running towards his wrist. In our anger and our silence, I was almost happy that Thursday had hurt him, but I felt guilty when Frank tried to be pleasant.
"Listen to this,"
he said. He lifted the book and read aloud.
"Catil swung his silver sword, forged from fire, a wizard's gift. It shone like the flames of hell. Through the air his sword flashed, and it sang a song of death and vengeance. Like a Valkyrie it sang."
Frank looked up at me again.
"I love this story."
"What's a Valkyrie?" I asked. He rolled his eyes.
"A lady of the warlord, you moron."